This is going to be a little different. We have two Bloomberg journalists talking to each other, and it's also a little different in that we tend to focus on chronicling capitalism. But we want to talk about equality today and how we've been covering that in India, and actually that is part of chronicling capitalism. And Arijit, you want to start by talking about how we've done that in India? What are some of the stories we've done, and how have we approached that here?
Right, Jodi. So we have actually been covering this topic, very important topic, even before the Me Too movement started in India. We've been reporting on not only on the social and human aspects of the story, but also the economic aspects. We've heard a lot of the participants before us talk about how 50% is out of the, off the table, which means that, the women, we've been talking to women and finding out what has been keeping them out of the workforce, which is very important. So, and part of the package of 3 stories, we just won an award from the Society of Publishers of Asia, which is very good. So we've been doing a lot, and we'll obviously continue to do a lot. But then it's not just India. We've been covering the subject in Japan and US, and you have been part of many of those stories. Maybe you could tell us what are the differences and similarities in the stories and the movement?
Yeah, I think it plays out differently, certainly around the world. We saw with the Me Too movement, which started just 2 years ago in the US, that was very workplace focused. There were allegations called out on social media, but also it had this kind of life of its own, and often there would be investigations in the companies, sometimes quickly, and then the person would leave and they would move on. In India, as you know, we saw it being a very social media focus, and women often at great risk to themselves, calling out people and getting that started. In Japan, a culture that's very communal, there wasn't Me Too because that was viewed as you wouldn't say something yourself. They called it We Too, and they actually supported each other in trying to get things changed there. We've seen it play out differently in Korea. So I think a takeaway from that is that different cultures and different societies are going to approach issues of equality in very different ways, and that's something that we have to think about in our coverage, how we cover that
right.
as
in
an
fact,
organization.
we just had a chart, and that showed that was a US-focused chart, if you can see that again, that shows that there has been a drop in sexual violence, unwanted sexual attention. And I think part of that reason is probably because we have been, as a media as a whole, have been kind of showcasing that everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I think so. We'd like to feel that we are part of the conversation that is moving this forward and that are holding people accountable as well. We just did a story this past weekend about we called it Me Too India a year later, and we looked at 5 different cases, 5 accusers and 5 accused, to see what had happened. And in part of it is sobering. Some of these women who were the accusers had faced a great deal of risk to their careers, to their reputations, some defamation suits, and it reminded us that it's difficult to bring about this kind of change. This doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without costs. But in covering it, we can be part of that conversation and continue to let the world see what is happening, and it's an evolving process, right?
Yeah. In fact, let me give you an example. As we were covering the story, one of our reporters, Archana Chaudhary, went to a village very close to Delhi in Uttar Pradesh, which we saw in the movie yesterday, Sun Rising, one of the places where we have these khap panchayats, and she was talking to the woman there, and they were engrossed in stories, and suddenly the woman there realized that it was getting dark. And they quickly wrapped up the conversation and left because they didn't want to really travel when it's dark and roads not properly lit. So those are some of the examples we saw, and not just that, but when we are talking about diversity, we are also talking about, for example, again, we saw during our reporting, we saw that we were hearing instances of Dalits, which is one of the lower castes in India, getting hit by violence, not only from the upper caste men, but also women. So that's again a totally different story talking about equality, but I thought I'll just mention what we saw in all our reporting instances actually.
Yeah, getting people to talk to us is often difficult as well. These stories are, first of all, they're very personal, and sometimes they're things that people feel ashamed about. We saw some of that in the movie last night too. And so our reporting has to be about continuing to go back to people and to say, we want to tell your story, but we also, we understand why it may be hard to tell your story. And sometimes that's where social media comes in. People are telling their stories there, and that's where it gets started. But of course, for us, we want to get the detail, and we also want to be fair. We have to look at both sides of this. Who are the people who are telling the stories? Who are they accusing? What is the other side of the story? And sometimes it's also playing out in court, so we have to cover the court case as well. So these are not necessarily easy stories to tell, but I think, as you point out, we have to be sensitive to the subjects of them, but still keep trying to do it.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, in India, it was all really a social media kind of driven initiative that had happened, unlike in the US where, the mainstream media was really reporting all the news. And so basically, we actually had to make sure that we are talking to everybody concerned and making sure all our stories are fair and to everybody that we're mentioning, actually.
Right. And it's not just equality. We're not just talking about gender. A lot of our reporting has been gender, but we've been doing some other kinds of equality reporting here as well, correct? There's other kinds of stories we're telling around the equality issue.
We had a LGBT story today itself, which you were also working on. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So we basically looked in the courts in India. Things have been moving forward in terms of giving more LGBT rights. Still not the same that you might see in the US, for example, with same-sex marriage, but we've seen that starting to happen here. And some of the people told us that was interesting was that it is now much more comfortable to have these conversations in the workplace because the court cases have said you can do this. And so there's a lot more interest. People who are LGBT are finding that they can talk about this in their workplaces in a way they couldn't even just a year or two ago, that this has made it easier for them, although they still see often a lot more work to be done. So it's evolving, and that's what we found. And I think that's important for us to think about as a news organization as well, in terms of covering equality, that we cover this in a broad range. It's not just gender. It is sexual orientation, it's class, it's culture, it's different abilities, which is something that can be tricky to cover as well.
Right, absolutely. And just going back to gender, we just again had another chart talking about the number of complaints after the Me Too movement. Unfortunately, that still hasn't changed a lot. So obviously, we need to do a lot more work there as a media to kind of make sure that this movement really doesn't suddenly die. Sometimes what happens is it's there in front of you in the front pages for a few weeks, and then it just goes away. So it's up to us to kind of make sure that we kind of keep reporting on this, and hopefully that number will change as well.
Yeah, I find the chart interesting that there was some movement, but not a lot. That it's,
exactly.
It kind of, I'm sure if you showed it before 2015, would have been way down here, and it's gone up, but it's now kind of at that same level, which is interesting, and something for us to think about in terms of our continued coverage as well.
Right. So, you also have been kind of just taking it away a little bit. You've also been working a lot on getting more women voices onto our Bloomberg terminal stories that we have been doing. Do you want to kind of also give us a little bit of idea on that as well? That also goes a long way in what we are trying to do.
Yeah, so as Laura Zelenko mentioned last night, we have this New Voices project where we are quoting more women in our stories. It is a core value of Bloomberg to do this now, and getting more women on television, on radio, on our panels. We actually started this whole effort here in Asia in 2016. It's very nice to see an Asian effort exported globally for us. But we've made real progress. Part of it is finding the women. At first, that was an issue. People said, well, we'd love to quote more women in our stories, but we don't have them. And so we made it a goal to go find women. And once you start talking to women about this, and you start and you ask them, hey, are there other women, that you know? Are there other women economists in this particular space? You get more and more, and we now have 5,000 women worldwide in a database. The other issue, of course, is television. Training is part of that, and that's why it's exciting to see the New Voices training coming here to Mumbai after we've had it in Hong Kong and London and New York and Sydney we added. But also, it's incumbent upon us as journalists to continue to push for this, because what we find, and it amazes me still to this day, but when we find new sources, when we go find women, we find other voices we haven't been quoting before, we get new stories, we break stories, we get what we call scoops, because other people haven't been talking to these folks, and all of a sudden we realize, oh, they know things that have not been brought to the table before. They just haven't had their voice out there, and once we have that voice, it's important on a number of levels, including for our own business initiative, for us having our reporting being not only more fair and more inclusive, but just better. We tell more stories, we break more news. So it's been exciting for us from a business perspective, as well as from an equality, doing the right thing perspective.
Right. I think as Pamela was saying just before this session, that it's quite important to get everybody in, and it kind of helps the business as well grow. I think we are running out of time now. Is there any last thoughts that you have, Jodi?
Well, the only thing I would say is, in doing this kind of reporting, we look at our whole newsroom. This isn't just a few people, and I know your whole team in India is involved in this, but we have to get everybody involved and say this is really important. Not only from the do the right thing perspective, but it makes us a better news organization. And so that's the challenge: is to keep this on the agenda and to keep it vibrant.
Great. Thank you so much again. Please, it's time for a networking break right next to us. Please join us. Thank you so much.